Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on our special coverage of the Seoul-Tokyo summit. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will have second face-to-face today after Tokyo summit back in March. This marks the official resumption of the long-halted reciprocal visits between the two nations as they seek to build momentum in mending bilateral ties. For more, we go straight over to our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young. Soo-young, has Kishida arrived yet?
Hi, Kyung-un. Yes, he has. We just saw him land at Seoul Airport and he stepped off the plane and got into a car, and he's now speeding towards his first commitment here in Seoul, paying his respects at Seoul National Cemetery, where people who died in the Korean War and also independent activists who resisted against Japan's brutal colonization lie at rest. And the cemetery is just across the bridge from where Kishida will be holding the summit here at the presidential office in Yongsan. President Yoon is going to greet him with an official welcoming ceremony, and the two leaders will then hold their summit talks, which will consist of a small group session attended by just a few high-level officials, then an expanded meeting. The key agenda items are expected to be national security amid growing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea, along with issues of common interest such as supply chain resiliency, high-tech industries, science and technology, as well as youth and cultural cooperation. Now, Yoon and Kishida are expected to announce more specific plans for building new relations in these key areas. A more controversial issue, however, may be Tokyo's plan to discharge treated radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan. The question of the safety and efficacy of the treatment method, as well as the credibility of Tokyo Electric Power Company's reporting, has been seriously concerning for neighbouring countries, including South Korea, not to mention marine biologists, environmentalists, as well as Japanese fishermen. Now, according to multiple diplomatic sources, Seoul is pushing for a joint safety inspection separate from the ongoing probe by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The agenda, though, hasn't been set in stone, but a senior presidential official here has said that there's no need to exclude the topic if South Koreans and the media are strongly concerned about the matter. Of course, as much as the two leaders are very keen on advancing their ties and cooperation in key strategic areas, historical issues remain due to domestic political sensitivities on both sides. And that said, the chances of a joint declaration after the summit are rather slim. And it seems that the two men are going to announce their respective positions as they did in Tokyo about 52 days ago.
Right, with Kishida's visit, are the reciprocal visits between the two nations now officially restored?
Right, yes. The top-level exchanges between the two leaders, between both sides, are now in full swing after 12 years. And, well, of course, the two leaders like to call this shuttle diplomacy, which has a slightly different meaning in the English language, but all the same, the shuttling back and forth between Seoul and Tokyo, now that's very meaningful, and it really signifies the remarkable improvement in bilateral ties that would have been very much unimaginable during the previous Moon and Abe governments, when relations between the two countries spiraled into a severe trade and diplomatic spat over historical disputes. There's been huge progress already after the Yoon administration took steps to compensate Korean victims of Imperial Japan's forced labour mobilization. They requested voluntary donations from the private sector instead of demanding Japanese firms pay up, which is what the court under the previous Moon government did. Of course, this has upset some civic groups in South Korea. The president's resolute position on closing the chapter on history has triggered a rather emotional response among the Korean public, even as they acknowledge the need to move forward for improved ties with Japan. Now, Prime Minister Kishida has clearly appreciated this rather big political sacrifice that President Yoon has been willing to make, and Kishida conveyed that his visit would be a response to Yoon's courageous move. Now, we'll have to see how the leaders get on today after their summit and dinner, which will be followed by a more private setting where they will have more personal one-on-one talks.
All right, so thank you for the reporting. Now, as seen in the previous report, this summit has its primary significance in resuming the so-called shuttle diplomacy between the two countries. Our political correspondent Ishu has its past and present.
On Sunday, President Yoon Suk-yeol is having summit talks with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in Seoul. Kishida's two-day return visit follows President Yoon's earlier visit to Tokyo from March 16th to 17th this year. Yoshihiko Noda was the last Japanese prime minister to visit Seoul for a top summit with then-President Lee Myung-bak in November of 2011. South Korea's presidential office said last week that the so-called shuttle diplomacy between the two countries has now recommenced for the first time in 12 years. The term shuttle diplomacy originally referred to when an outside party mediates negotiations between two or more countries. But in the case of the relationship between South Korea and Japan, it refers to the leaders of the two countries taking turns visiting each other to hold discussions. The history of Seoul-Tokyo shuttle diplomacy goes back to 2004 with then-President of South Korea Roh Moo-hyun and Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. But the exchanges stopped when a year later, Koizumi paid a visit to the controversial Yasukuni War Shrine, honoring the country's war dead, including 14 Class A war criminals. With the beginning of the Lee Myung-bak administration in 2008, exchange visits and talks resumed only to halt once again over certain issues such as the so-called comfort woman and disputes over Dokdo Island. Then President Yoon Suk-yeol, who came into office in 2022, emphasized the need for cooperation with Japan.
일본은 이제 세계 시민의 자유를 위협하는 도전에 맞서 함께 힘을 합쳐 나아가야 하는 이웃입니다.
In March of this year, the South Korean government announced a plan to compensate the victims of Japan's wartime forced labor through funds procured domestically in the country. 10 days later, President Yoon visited Tokyo to speak with Prime Minister Kishida.
그간 얼어붙은 양국 관계로 인해 양국 국민들께서 직간접적으로 피해를 입어왔다는 데 공감하고 한일 관계를 조속히 회복 발전시켜 나아가자는 데 뜻을 같이 하였습니다.
I agreed with President Yoon Suk-yeol to resume shuttle diplomacy, to make frequent exchange visits free of restrictions and formality, and to open a new chapter in bilateral relations.
All eyes are now on what achievements will come from the summit, where talks are expected on collaborations in security, technology, and culture. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Taking center stage during the summit talks will be cooperation on security, not just between the two countries, but also involving the U.S. against advancing North Korean threats. Our Kim Hyun-sung takes a look.
Security to take center stage this whole Tokyo summit, with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida likely to discuss extended nuclear deterrence against North Korea's growing weapons threat. Just last month, President Yoon visited Washington, where he lobbied for increased U.S. commitment to extended nuclear deterrence in the region. The Washington Declaration was subsequently issued, with President Joe Biden promising more robust support and frequent deployment of American strategic assets. Now, with Seoul and Tokyo working to strengthen their relationship, the two are expected to talk about Japan possibly joining the Extended Nuclear Deterrence Initiative, potentially forming a consultative group with South Korea and the United States. However, how this will look is yet unclear. South Korean press outlet Donghwa-ilbo has reported that the three countries are already discussing forming the Trilateral group, which could involve sharing real-time information on missile firings. As of now, it's still too early to confirm any details. Further clarity is expected between May 19th and 21st, when President Yoon is invited to participate in the Group of Seven summit hosted by Prime Minister Kishida in Hiroshima, Japan. The two leaders and President Biden are expected to hold a three-way talk on the summit sidelines to address security concerns among other agendas. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
The summit comes as the two nations normalize their trade partnership and seek to foster cooperation on the supply chains. Our Moon Ae-ryun has the summit's economic prospects.
Following his summit with South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol on Sunday, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is on Monday scheduled to hold talks with the chairman of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry and other leaders of 6 economic organizations. It's the first time in 12 years that a Japanese prime minister has visited Seoul, and on the agenda is enhancing economic exchange between the two countries, as well as cooperation in the field of advanced new industries.
I think those two issues are most important. One, cooperation and international investment between the two countries, and the second, the interaction of the people, interaction of the research people, business people, students between the two countries, I think are two most important issues that has to be discussed in the summit meeting.
Back in 2019, following a dispute over wartime compensation, Seoul removed Japan from its whitelist after Tokyo did the same and imposed export restrictions on materials necessary for producing displays and semiconductors. But at the end of last month, following Yoon's visit to Japan in March, Seoul's Trade Ministry released a notice to make amendments to the country's whitelist of strategic goods export destinations, reinstating Japan to the top-tier class of trading partner nations. If Japan returns Korea to the whitelist as it is announced, the export and import procedures for the semiconductor materials and equipment will become much smoother. This normalization of economic exchange is expected to have a positive impact on supply chain stability across the semiconductor and energy sectors, partially alleviating the disruptions caused by the rapidly changing supply chains led by the United States and Europe. During an interview with Japanese news outlet Nikkei on Wednesday, Seoul's finance minister emphasized the need for Korea and Japan to cooperate in response to rising energy prices. Japan last year reclaimed its title as the world's biggest liquefied gas buyer from China. Finance Minister Chu said that it's in the best interest of both countries to pursue joint development due to their geographic proximity and competitiveness in manufacturing and material components. South Korea and Japan share a common point of a shortage of resources and high dependence on trade. It remains to be seen whether talks over the next 2 days will address these issues. 문혜련, Arirang News.
But at today's summit, all eyes are on whether Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will offer words of remorse and apology for Japan's wartime forced labor. Our Han Sung will talk to some experts about the chances.
Will Fumio Kishida offer a sincere apology to South Korea for Japan's imperial past and wartime forced labor? It's the biggest question looming over the Japanese Prime Minister's visit, and experts say the Korean public likely won't see him apologize.
At this point, Japan needs to spontaneously apologize, but the nation's very critical of such a move. Why? Well, Japan doesn't want to pass on the burden of apologizing for and reflecting on its imperial past from generation to generation to its citizens of tomorrow.
Analysts like Director Jin predict Kishida, as he did back in March, will instead stick to upholding the stance on historical recognition made by Japan's previous cabinets, including the historic 1998 joint declaration between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Oguchi, which delivered Tokyo's, quote, deep remorse and heartfelt apology. Seeking to improve bilateral ties, Seoul has introduced plans to solve the long-standing dispute with Japan over how to compensate the victims of wartime forced labor. That includes establishing so-called future partnership funds from the Federation of Korean Industries and the Japan Business Federation. And a key point of interest moving forward will be whether Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, two Japanese companies ordered by the Korean Supreme Court in 2018 to compensate, will contribute. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
For more on the significance and prospects of the Yoon Kishida summit, we're joined in the studio by Han Shuttle, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Kyunghyun. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Well, first of all, I would like to touch upon the timing of Kishida's visit because many were expecting him to visit after the G7 summit, but he's making the trip before that. What is your take on that?
Right. It's an interesting time to have the visit, Kyung-in. It's about 2 weeks now, just short of 2 weeks before the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima. And of course, it's just a little bit after President Yoon's visit to Washington, D.C. So I think between the security issues that were discussed in Washington regarding nuclear sharing and coordination from the U.S. and Seoul, there might be some interest in figuring out a way for Japan to play a part in the upcoming arrangements to security architecture in this part of the region. So I'm sure that might be on the table. And the other element that I think maybe be more front and center, given that the G7 is expected to focus a lot on economic issues, will be ways the two countries can collaborate, perhaps advance some shared interests at the upcoming G7, and also maybe some measures finally from Japan to put South Korea back on the so-called white list, reciprocating on the gesture that President Yoon gave Japan back earlier this spring, basically designating Japan once again a preferential trade partner. The Korean government has been saying that they expect a similar step from Prime Minister Kishida. It could come perhaps before we see the G7 meet.
Well, also, it was interesting to see how the coordination of the summit came about in Japan. Even before the two governments announced the official date of the summit, we saw Japanese media reporting about the date and also Kishida telling reporters in advance about his planned visit to South Korea. It seems like a rare scene in diplomacy, and it seems like Japan is more actively coordinating the summit. What is your take on that?
Well, it seems either Prime Minister Kishida just let it slip a little bit ahead of the game before the two countries were ready to announce it at the same moment. It might have just been something very small that his office hadn't told him to hold off on making a statement. But clearly it shows that the Japanese government is not hesitant at this point in having further talks with South Korea. Why should they be hesitant? They've been getting a pretty good deal from this country over the past couple of months.
Right. And now let's talk about agenda items. Of course, Seoul's presidential office has been highlighting that this summit is really about resuming the reciprocal visits between the two nations rather than producing some concrete joint statements or agreements between the two nations. But we are seeing that Seoul is seemingly trying to take things slow. But at the same time, what is it that Seoul is trying to gain by actively resuming these reciprocal visits between the two nations?
Right. Both countries are in an awkward but interesting kind of dance here, I think. President Yoon has, in a sense, really stuck his neck out to try to be more accommodating to Japan. I think both leaders also are trying to be accommodating to President Biden in the United States. It's very well known that when Korea and Japan don't get along well, that there's pushback and concern, even alarm about that in Washington, D.C. So President Biden, over the past few years, has been trying to rebuild alliance politics in East Asia. His predecessor, of course, Donald Trump, had kind of downplayed the importance of having a coherent alliance in Northeast Asia at a time when, of course, President Moon here and Prime Minister Abe in Japan were not exactly the best of friends either. So in a way, the stars have realigned in a sense, and I think both leaders are trying to get out in front now and be there for the U.S. I'm sure there'll be some discussions along these lines on the sidelines of the G7 in a couple of weeks, if not the summit itself. And then on the other hand, President Yoon's population here, the Korean public, they're the ones who actually might be wishing that President Yoon would take it a little bit slow or slower. He's already made some concessions to Japan that we can talk about. And I think the public wants to see something from Japan in return for some of the gestures, including the white list, including the trade arrangements, but certainly not limited to that either. A whole lot of other things.
Well, but domestically speaking, though, Japan's wartime forced labor is always at the center of the talks and attention. And eyes are really on whether Prime Minister Kishida will offer a direct or clear message of an apology to the issue, because the last time he met President Yoon, he did address the historical issues, but the message of apology was rather indirect and low-key manner. So Are we expecting some stronger message of an apology this time?
Right. This is the big question, I think, Kyung-eun, as you pointed out, and as your reporters are pointing out this afternoon. First of all, as we've seen so far, the improved goodwill at the presidential and prime ministerial levels has not yet brought about any kind of stronger statement from Japan than we've seen in the past. You know, Japan, of course, has made various statements of regret or remorse. 1998 was one good example when former President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Abuchi had, another declaration that at that time there were some statements of remorse that were issued, but, even then it was something short of a full apology. I'm actually very intrigued by the upcoming visit this afternoon to the National Cemetery. If there's a window in this summit where we could see some kind of statement along these lines from Japan, it might very well be there because, as was pointed out in your report earlier, there are some independence fighters that are buried there. So will Prime Minister Kishida take this head on? Will they go to that location of the cemetery that's very significant in terms of Korea's struggle for national independence? It reminds me a little bit of a visit that was made in Europe by the leaders of France and Germany back in 1984. Then President of France, Francois Mitterrand, and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Again, these countries had been at odds in 2 world wars, and they went to a cemetery in France, in a location called Verdun, that had hundreds of thousands of war dead buried there, French and German soldiers that had fought in this part of France in the First World War especially. And the 2 leaders, at one point in the rain, they didn't have umbrellas, they joined hands, they held hands for a very long period of time and were silent. And it sent a really important gesture to the publics in both countries, a signal to the publics in both countries that something was changing. And Germany and France were in a different place than they were before. So I just, again, I'm not orchestrating the visit, I'm just sitting here trying to think alongside you and everybody else about what could happen. That would be one opportunity. If Kishida says something or does something or expresses some stronger sentiments than Japan has in the past, it would come there. If we don't see it there, then I guess we're not going to get it at this summit, most likely. We'll have to wait for another opportunity.
Right, we're just going to have to wait and see. But we have to admit that domestic politics really play a big role in Seoul-Tokyo relations. And as for Japan, Kishida's ruling party won by-elections just recently, and his approval ratings are seeing a rise. And we are wondering if that could lead to a more compromising approach by Japan to South Korea over some sensitive issues, because that's all the more important for President Yoon, because South Korea's general elections are coming up in a year. What is your take on that?
So yes, the domestic politics in both countries are very important. And as you pointed out, the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, this kind of dominant political party in Japan, has been reinforced recently in some parliamentary elections for the upper house. Things went so well, getting 4 out of 5 seats in that election, that Prime Minister Kishida now is actually in a strong position where he could call an election for the House of Representatives sooner instead of later. Of course, the House of Representatives in Japan is similar to the House of Commons in Great Britain. So if the Prime Minister is doing well, they can, and their party's doing well, they can call elections sooner and get their majority reinforced. So that could happen even sooner, I think, than 2025. We'll see. But in South Korea, by contrast, President Yoon is facing a lot of pushback in domestic public opinion, as you pointed out. So I think Japan has to, at this point, if they really want this diplomacy to continue and to kind of continue to move forward, they're going to have to give a little bit more than they have so far. Maybe in the form of a statement or an apology, ideally an apology, as we were discussing a moment ago, and also perhaps some money. So here's where the court case that was let go, in a sense. We had this decision by the Supreme Court here in Korea that Japanese businesses, it's a decision a few years ago, that Japanese businesses should come up with $3 million roughly to compensate a group of victims of forced labor during the occupation period here in the early half of the 20th century. You know, President Yoon letting go of that, that doesn't stop Japan from coming up with some sort of voluntary gesture, either from the business sector or the government sector, to provide some sort of compensation financially to the Korean public. So we'll see. I know that's what many people in public opinion here are looking for. Will that actually emerge? In Japan, of course, public opinion, they're not necessarily interested in going too overboard with apologies or money as well at their end, but I think there may be some room in Japanese public opinion right now for Kishida to make a statement in a way that wouldn't lose too much face for Japan, that could seem voluntary instead of coerced. And can he kind of strike that balance and walk that line to make that happen? It'll be interesting to see if he can do that in the next couple of days here.
Right. In the meantime, we're expecting security, of course, to take the center stage in the summit talks, especially because this is coming before the G7 summit, as you previously mentioned, with trilateral summit between South Korea, Japan, and United States highly likely. What are some possible topics to be discussed on that security front?
Well, one is that we are still waiting for the details on the nuclear consultation arrangement that's going to be worked out between the Republic of Korea and the United States, and I think it's not yet been fully clarified whether there's some sort of place for Japan in all of this as well. Of course, the U.S. does have military bases in Japan. When the U.S. is looking at the big picture of Northeast Asia security and also the landscape of its relationship with China, the fact that in a sense the U.S. is building up several partner countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We could even expand it to the Indo-Pacific region and go to South Asia as well. How are Japan and South Korea going to be coordinated in some sort of approach? Not necessarily checking China outright, although that's certainly what it seems like, but to, in a sense, allow the countries in this region that are liberal democracies to kind of stand their ground. And also, I think in the background, there's a lot of concern about Taiwan amid the war in Ukraine, and again, amid an increasingly assertive China, whether Taiwan's security is in somewhat of a state of jeopardy right now compared to times past, and how, you know, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea might send some sort of signal that the status quo should remain with Taiwan and that mainland China should not do anything to disrupt Taiwan. So I think that's in the background. Whether that will be front and center either here or the G7, who knows? But I think that's one reason it's important that the Republic of Korea and Japan are talking right now.
Right. Also, for the first time, the two leaders could possibly address Japan's planned release of wastewater from its destroyed Fukushima nuclear power plant. And that will be the very first time for the two leaders to address that rather sensitive issue, right? Are we expecting any agreement or joint statement, possibly a joint inspection efforts?
Right, let's see, Kyung-in. This, first of all, is a very sensitive issue even within Japan itself, especially in the immediate area around Fukushima. The public in Japan, at least in the public opinion surveys I've seen, is very guarded about releasing wastewater. They eat the fish too, and the fishing industry is very dependent on, you know, trying to rebuild at this point after 10 years of disruption already from the Fukushima accident. So even within Japan, Prime Minister Kishida has still got a constituency here that's not happy with the plan. And just about every country in the region, not just South Korea, but Taiwan and China, everybody is voicing concerns. I guess what's been happening, from what I read anyway, is that, you know, there's over 1 million tons now, 1 million tons of water that's been piling up as water keeps going through that nuclear power plant to cool it after the terrible meltdown there a decade ago. Japan's been putting all the water in storage tanks. They've got so many storage tanks, they seem to have nowhere to put them. It's now been a decade. The only organization that seems to be giving Japan the green light with confidence here, interestingly, is the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think there's some skepticism as to whether they're giving Japan the green light too quickly. Now, Japan is saying that they are basically refiltering all the water before they release it. So the radioactive substances will be filtered out, and that the water that's being released won't be all that different in radioactivity from the kind of water that gets released from nuclear power plants along the coast routinely, including nuclear power plants right here in South Korea. There are several that are on the water that release into the ocean. I think what's needed, whether it's some sort of joint statement or joint agreement, first of all, President Yoon needs something from Prime Minister Kishida to reassure the public on this issue. And the way to get that, I'm guessing, might be between whatever South Korea is going to say and whatever international monitoring is going to take place. I think Japan has to promise that the water there that's going out, if they're going to do this, is going to be refiltered maybe even a third time with very tight international monitoring to make sure that the water going out is going to be no different than what would, again, routinely be coming out of a nuclear power plant. If they can prove that beyond a doubt, then maybe there's room for some acceptance of this. But I can very well understand why there's reticence, and I think those that are expressing concern all around the region are right to do so. This was a terrible destructive accident, and that it affected us all. We probably all have little pieces of Fukushima inside us after this. So there is cause for a very tough measure on this, and we'll see what emerges over the next couple of days, and more important, beyond.
All right, Professor Hans Shuttle, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you for having me, Hyung-in.
Now, the active diplomacy between heads of state is coming at a time when exchanges are gaining momentum at the people-to-people level, especially among younger generations. Our Kim Jung-sil has this one.
The Japanese animation Suzume. More than 5 million people in South Korea have been to see it since the film was released in the country this March. This has made it the #1 most viewed film during that time. And before that, in less than 3 months, around 4 million people have been to see another popular Japanese animation, the first Slam Dunk.
It seems that the initial consumer fan base for Japanese animation is very broad here in South Korea, and many people love them. Both movies seem to have been hits.
Japan, meanwhile, isn't too different. Most of the country's top-viewed Netflix content are Korean dramas, including Queenmaker and The Glory. Experts say these types of exchanges in cultural content will be beneficial in order for the two countries to better understand each other.
The consumption of this cultural content cannot directly solve the underlying political and historic issues, but it can definitely help understand each other better, which can be a first step towards resolving deeper issues.
As Korean dramas become hugely popular in Japan, more Japanese tourists have visited Korea in recent months. The number of Japanese tourists tripled to more than 190,000 in March compared to January. In fact, most foreign visitors to Korea this year so far have been from Japan. More than 40% were people in their teenage years or 20s.
I visited Korea more than 10 times. Korea itself is a bit of a trend in Japan right now, and it goes beyond K-dramas. People love Korean food, music, and fashion as well.
Experts say with the resumption of the so-called shuttle diplomacy between the leaders of South Korea and Japan, exchanges of culture content and people-to-people visits will most likely gain further momentum. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
That is all for this hour. Stay tuned. More updates on the way.
번 2분